NBC News brings you a special Platform Committee report. This is Richard Valeriani in the NBC radio booth at the Platform Committee hearings in the Park Ballroom of the Sheraton Park Hotel in Washington. The second public session is about to begin with Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara as the chief witness. After McNamara delivers his prepared statement, he'll answer questions from members of the Platform Committee. He is just introduced. Robert McNamara has just been introduced by the chairman of the Platform Committee, Congressman Carl Albert of Oklahoma. The Secretary of Defense.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My purpose this afternoon is to review the defense program of this administration, to report to you and to the American people on the fulfillment of the pledges made by President Johnson and then Vice President Johnson and President Kennedy in 1960, and to recommend our defense policies for the coming years. The defense establishment we found in 1961 was based on a strategy of massive nuclear retaliation as the answer to all forms of military and political aggression. We, however, were convinced that our enemies would never find credible a strategy which even the American people did not believe. We believed in a strategy of controlled, flexible response where the military force of this country would become a finely tuned instrument of national policy, versatile enough to meet with appropriate force the full spectrum of threats to our national security, ranging all the way from the low-level threat of guerrilla operations to all-out nuclear war. The Defense Department we found in 1961 was one in which each military service made its own independent plans. We found the Army, for example, relying on an airlift capability which the Air Force was unable to provide. We found the Army envisioning a long war and therefore stockpiling supplies for as long as 2 years, while the Air Force, envisioning a short war, had supplies for only a few days. We found a weapons inventory completely lacking in certain major elements required for combat readiness. We believed in balanced, integrated forces, military forces equipped to respond with appropriate power at whatever level of threat. In 1961, we found military strategy to be the stepchild of predetermined budget levels. A financial ceiling was placed on national security, and funds were allocated not on the basis of military requirements, but according to the dictates of an arbitrary fiscal policy. While we believed that our defense forces should be procured and operated at the lowest possible cost, we were convinced that only the safety of our nation should determine the levels of military force to be assembled. The strategic nuclear force we found was vulnerable to surprise missile attack. The non-nuclear forces we found were weak in combat-ready divisions, weak in tactical air squadrons, and weak in airlift capabilities. The counterinsurgency forces, the type that we are using in South Vietnam today, were for all practical purposes, non-existent. We believe that the United States must be supreme in all types of military force to meet all types of aggression across the entire spectrum of conflict. And that is why in 1960, President Kennedy and Vice President Johnson made 3 pledges relating to defense. First, they pledged to recast our military capacity in order to provide forces and weapons of a diversity, a balance, and a mobility sufficient to deter both limited and general aggression. And secondly, they pledged to create deterrent military power such that the Soviet and Chinese leaders will have no doubt that an attack on this country would surely be followed by their own destruction. And thirdly, they pledged to pursue continuous modernization of our forces through intensified research and development programs, and to include essential programs which had been slowed down, terminated, suspended, or otherwise neglected for lack of budgetary funds. When I became Secretary of Defense in January of 1961, President Kennedy gave me two primary instructions, two instructions which President Johnson has strongly re-emphasized. First, he asked that I determine the military force required to serve as a solid foundation for our foreign policy, and to do this without regard to predetermined financial limits or arbitrary budget ceilings. And secondly, he asked that, having determined the military force required, that we procure and operate it at the lowest possible cost. In his first State of the Union message, you'll remember that President Kennedy said, "I've instructed the Secretary of Defense to reappraise our entire defense strategy, our ability to fulfill our commitments, the effectiveness, vulnerability, and dispersal of our strategic bases, our forces, and our early warning systems, the efficiency and the economy of our operations and organization, the elimination of obsolete bases and installations, and the adequacy, modernization, and mobility of our present conventional and nuclear forces." Under the direction of Presidents Kennedy and Johnson, with the full cooperation of the Congress, as a matter of fact, with the full support of the leaders of both political parties, aided by dedicated and able assistants both in and out of uniform, and with the backing of the American people, we've been able to fulfill those pledges. We've vastly increased both our strategic nuclear and our conventional forces. And on these charts that I will point to now, you will see the increases, some of the increases which have taken place since 1961. Between 1961 and the present time, there has been a 150% increase in the number of nuclear warheads in our strategic alert forces. These are the missile and bomber forces which are in such a high state of alert that we can expect to launch them between the time when we receive warning of an impending attack, warning from our ballistic missile early warning system, and the time the enemy warheads detonate on our airfields and therefore subject our bombers to destruction. So I say there's been a 150% increase in the number of nuclear warheads in that strategic alert force. And that 150% increase has brought a 200% increase in the megatonnage of that alert force. There's been a 60% increase in the tactical nuclear forces in Western Europe, a 45% increase in the number of combat-ready divisions in our Army, a 44% increase in the number of our tactical fighter squadrons in the Air Force, a 75% increase in the airlift capability, and much larger increases are in prospect. A 100% increase in general ship construction, this of course to modernize our fleet. An 800% increase in the special forces trained for counterinsurgency, the forces which we're using today in South Vietnam. Now, to appreciate the full extent of this force, we must contrast it with that of our principal adversary. And by such a test, our strategic nuclear superiority is incontestable. Our strategic force today includes 1,100 bombers. Of this 1,100 bombers, 550 are on 15-minute alert. These are equipped with decoy missiles and with other penetration aids to assure that they will reach their targets. In contrast, the Soviet Union could with some difficulty place over this country only slightly more than 100 heavy bombers, plus 150 medium bombers, which could be placed over Canada and certain portions of the northwestern part of our own country. And this gives us then, as you see on this next chart, a 4-to-1 superiority over the Soviets in our bomber force. We have in intercontinental ballistic missiles over 800 missiles on launchers, fully deployed and fully operational today. The bulk of these, over 600, are deployed in hardened underground silos, dispersed, buried deeply below the surface, and assured of survival, therefore. In contrast, the Soviets have only 200 intercontinental ballistic missiles, the great majority of these above the surface, subject to attack and destruction. Again, a superiority of about 4-to-1 in our favor. In submarine-launched ballistic missiles, We have 256 Polaris missiles in 16 operational submarines today. We're building 25 more. They will carry a total of 400 additional Polaris missiles. In contrast, the Soviet has about 142 ballistic missiles in submarines today, a much smaller force, a much less effective force. All of our Polaris missiles are carried in nuclear-powered submarines. Only a small percentage of the Soviet missiles are in nuclear-powered submarines. All of our Polaris missiles can be launched from below the surface. None of the Soviet operational missiles are capable of subsurface launch. All of our Polaris missiles have ranges of in excess of 1,500 miles. The Soviet missiles have ranges of less than a third of that. And moreover, these strategic forces, which I've just summarized for you, will soon be further increased by the addition of the new Polaris A-3 missile, a missile with much larger range and larger payload, and the new Minuteman II. The Minuteman II is as great an advance over the Minuteman I as the B-52 bomber was over the B-47. It will be more than 8 times as effective as its predecessor. These and many other new weapon developments are products of our continuing efforts to keep the pledge that we made in 1960 and to make certain, in President Johnson's words, that the United States is and will remain first in the use of science and technology for the protection of its people. We have, as a matter of fact, increased by 50% the expenditures for research and development over the level prevailing during the last 4 years of the previous administration. We're spending about $6.5 billion a year for military research and development at the present time, and that compares with $4 billion spent in the last 4 years each year by the previous administration. We've initiated 208 new weapons development projects, and this includes 77 projects costing $10 million or more each. I'd like to mention just a few of these to give you an idea of the magnitude of the research and development program. These are new weapon systems initiated or carried to completion during this administration. The first of these illustrations is the SR-71 airplane. This is a new manned strategic reconnaissance aircraft to be assigned to the Strategic Air Command. It will fly at speeds in excess of 2,000 miles per year, or per hour. It will fly at altitudes in excess of 80,000 feet. It will be deployed to that command beginning at the end of next year. The next illustration is the Nike X. This is an anti-ballistic missile system on which we're spending about $400 million per year for development at the present time. It will give us the option of deploying the most advanced anti-ballistic missile system in the world should our security demand that. The next is the A-7A. This is a naval aircraft. It'll be a superior attack aircraft with twice the range of the naval plane it will replace, the A-4E. The next is the EX-10. This is a heavy, new torpedo to be used against deep-diving, fast nuclear submarines. The next is a main battle tank. This is a joint development project we're carrying on with West Germany. It will provide armor superiority both to West Germany and the United States during the decade of the 1970s. And the last illustration I want to call your attention to is the F-111. This is a revolutionary, supersonic, new swept-wing airplane, a fighter bomber that will provide more than double the range and several times the payload of any existing fighter bomber. Now, I want to assure you that our strategic nuclear forces are and will continue to be throughout the 1960s and throughout the decade of the 70s sufficient in size and in power to ensure the destruction of the Soviet Union and Communist China, and to do so under the worst imaginable circumstances accompanying the outbreak of war. There should be no doubt of this fact in the minds of any American. There is no doubt of that fact in the minds of our enemies. But nuclear power alone is not enough. Such power was not usable against the Soviets when they blockaded our friends in Berlin. Such power was not usable against the communists in Greece in 1947, was not usable in Malaya in 1948, was not used against the communist guerrillas in the Philippines in 1950, was not usable to protect our destroyers in the Gulf of Tonkin in 1964, and such power is not usable against the Viet Cong guerrillas today in South Vietnam. The effectiveness of this massive strategic nuclear deterrent which we have assembled has driven our enemies to acts of political and military aggression at the lower end of the spectrum of conflict. The communists now seek to test our capacity, to test our will, to test our patience at the lower end of this spectrum by crawling under the nuclear defenses of the free world. The threat that Castro presents to Latin America and the challenge before us today in South Vietnam lies not in nuclear war, but in the twilight zone of guerrilla terror and subversion. And to deal with this new form of political and military aggression, to deal with similar acts of violence which are less than all-out war, since 1961, we've added about 100,000 men to the strength of our Army. We've increased the number of combat-ready divisions from 11 to 16. We've increased the number of tactical fighter squadrons from 55 to 79. We've trained over 100,000 officers in counter-guerrilla actions and operations. And we put into production the new C-141 aircraft, which between 1961 and 1968 will increase our airlift capability and therefore our mobility by over 400%. Now, what I've described to you in the past few minutes is an aggregation of force without parallel in world history. To create and maintain such a force has required the investment of about $30 billion more in fiscal years 1962 through 1965 than would have been spent had we followed the budget levels of the previous administration. In January 1961, we introduced an integrated cycle of planning that anticipates on a continuing 5-year basis our total military requirements, and therefore our national strategy, our national foreign policy and our national military strategy, our military force structure, the contingency war plans, and the defense budget are now all related one to another. Today, our entire defense effort is planned as a unified whole. This system eliminates wasteful duplication. It weeds out programs which have lost their original promise, thereby freeing resources for more profitable application elsewhere in our society. And through it, we've been able to provide and to maintain a balanced and a flexible force which is capable of meeting the challenge at the lowest possible cost. The determination to maintain the necessary military force for our national security without regard to arbitrary budget limits does not mean that we discard either common sense or prudent management. True economy, of course, is not really the product of arbitrary budget ceilings. It never has been. True economy in the nation's defenses consists in buying only what we need, in buying it at the lowest possible price, and in operating it with maximum efficiency and at lowest cost. In the absence of these precepts, our reconstituted defense force would have cost several $billion per year more than the $50 billion we are now spending on it each year. But by following these precepts, by translating them into the Defense Department's cost reduction program, we saved through efficiency improvements alone $2.5 billion in fiscal 1964. A year and a half ago, when the Defense Department's cost reduction program was first initiated, I stated to President Kennedy I believed we could, through efficiency improvements alone, save $1.5 billion in that department in 1964. At the end of the fiscal year, a few weeks ago, the savings amounted to $2.5 billion. Based on that success, we have promised President Johnson that we will increase the savings to $4.6 billion per year, each year, every year, by fiscal 1968. Now, I want to emphasize that we could not have instituted the integrated system by which we have increased our military strength and by which we've increased our efficiency without the wholehearted support of all of our men and women in uniform. Neither this system which we are operating or any other system will ever be a substitute for sound judgment. Under this administration, professional military judgment from all four services has been a critical factor in the planning of our defense strategy. As General Maxwell Taylor, then chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, stated in 1963, the voice of the American soldier is entitled to a serious hearing in our national councils. And I'm happy to report to you that today he receives that hearing. In summary, then, development of the greatest military power in human history, with a capability to respond to every level of political and military aggression across the entire spectrum of conflict. That is beyond question the most significant achievement in the defense establishment during our years in office. Having placed this vast power at the disposal of the President, we've also given him the means to control it. His is an awesome responsibility. A full-scale nuclear exchange between the Soviet Union and the United States, which would take place in less than an hour, would kill almost 100 million Americans, the equivalent of more than 300 World War IIs. And there would be little comfort to us to know that it also killed 100 million Russians. The awesome responsibility to unleash this force, I believe, can rest only on the highest elected official in this country, the President of the United States. And that is why we have devoted such talent, such energy, to bring nuclear weapons under the actual as well as the theoretical control of the President. Our best scientists have created the most secure, the most dependable communications and command and control system conceived by man. Every step, from the first command to the final firing, is participated in by two or more people following intricate and highly secret procedures. Each of these procedures is personally approved by the President himself. We in defense will spare no energy to make certain that the President of the United States, and he alone, has complete control over the dispatch of our nuclear weapons. I consider the provision of this control to the President my most solemn obligation as Secretary of Defense. I believe this has also been the view of every President of the United States, every Secretary of State, and every Secretary of Defense in the nuclear era. As President Johnson himself has said, I believe that the final responsibility for all decisions on nuclear weapons must rest with the civilian head of this government, the President of the United States. And I believe that that is the way the American people want it. And Mr. Chairman, this is the first pledge, and this is the most important pledge that I would recommend we make to the American people in 1964. And now, ladies and gentlemen, I'd be happy to try to answer questions you have on this subject of defense. Yes.
In the Republican platform of 1964, adopted by the Republican National Convention, it is stated that that is the administration, has encouraged an increase of aggression in South Vietnam by appearing to set limits on America's willingness to act. And then, in the deepening struggle, it has sacrificed the lives of American and allied fighting men by denial of modern equipment. Now, sir, do you have a comment on that we could possibly incorporate into our platform?
Yes. Our policy at the present time with respect to South Vietnam is to provide to the South Vietnamese the logistical support, the training and transport assistance, the military advice, which they request of us and which they can utilize in carrying out their campaign against the terrorism and the guerrilla operations of the communist Viet Cong. We have told our military commanders in South Vietnam that they have the equivalent of a blank check on the entire military establishment of this country, and they can draw upon us for the people and for the materiel which they believe the South Vietnamese can properly and effectively utilize in countering the guerrilla operations that are seeking to undermine that government. We have never failed to respond to a request from the military commanders and the senior military officials in South Vietnam. We will never fail to respond to any such request as long as I am Secretary of Defense. I know that that is the President's policy. Next question.
In a speech delivered by Senator Goldwater here in this hotel on August the 10th in '64 to the National Association of Counties, he made this statement, and I'd like to have you remark on it concerning what the next decade may bring. He states, and I quote from his speech prepared by the Republican administration, "Our appropriations for strategic deterrent forces of all sorts have been declining steadily. In the current fiscal year, they are hardly half of what they were 3 fiscal years ago. And what of this, the most perilous statistic of all, under our present defense leadership with its utter disregard for new weapons, our deliverable nuclear capacity may be cut down by 90% the next decade." My number one question is this: does Senator Goldwater have access to these figures, or did he have access to these figures as of August the 10th? And also, what about the nuclear strength that we can expect in this?
Yes, I think he's had access to these figures. I haven't had access to his figure. But let me say first that within 60 days after taking office, President Kennedy sent to the Congress a budget amendment to the fiscal '62 budget, which had been submitted prior to the date of his inauguration. In that budget amendment, he added over $1.5 billion to increase our strategic forces, both the Polaris Force and the Minuteman Force. Secondly, in the subsequent fiscal year, fiscal 1963, the budget for the strategic forces was again increased. And again in 1964, the budget for the strategic forces remained far above the levels of 1960 and 61. Now, with these increased budgets, as you might expect, we have been able to very rapidly, very quickly build up this massive force you've seen. And I think it's to be expected under those circumstances that the budget for strategic forces, not the total defense establishment, but the budget for strategic forces will drop. I hope it will. It should. But I want to emphasize to you there is only one standard we apply in developing the size of our strategic force. Only one requirement it is asked to meet, and that is this: the force must be large enough to survive a Soviet surprise
We're sorry,
attack
we must
on this
interrupt.
country.
Secretary of Defense
To
Robert
survive with
McNamara is
sufficient
still
power.
testifying at the second public session of the full platform committee of the Democratic Party. McNamara's chief point was that the President of the United States alone must have complete control over the use of nuclear weapons. The Democrats are expected to write this into their 1964 platform and make the question of presidential control over nuclear weapons one of the major campaign issues. The Republican presidential candidate, Senator Barry Goldwater of Arizona, has advocated giving American field commanders the authority to use nuclear weapons in certain circumstances. McNamara also appeared to be answering a number of charges contained in the Republicans' 1964 platform, which presented a severe indictment of America's defense posture. He said there had been considerable gains in U.S. military strength and a number of new weapons systems initiated in the last 3 years. He claimed the U.S. is far stronger than the Soviet Union militarily and will remain that way. This has been a special Platform Committee report from NBC News. This is Richard Valeriani at the Democratic Platform hearings in the Sheraton Park Hotel in Washington.
This is the NBC Radio Network.